As lovely as Canada seems on the surface with its free healthcare and apologetic nature, the issues lying just beneath the surface are scathingly ugly. The missing and murdered Indigenous women is just one instance of the social insensitivity in Canada. An epidemic is occurring, and it revolves around Indigenous cultural genocide, a national crisis. A staggering 11,017 Indigenous women and girls were murdered between 1980 and 2012 in Canada. This is a homicide rate 4.5 times greater than that of women of all other ethnicities. Back in September of 2016, when Trudeau's Liberal government was elected into power, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was created, a completed $92 million project. The report, titled Reclaiming Power and Place, is 1,200 pages long, containing 231 calls for justice. As per Marion Buller, who is the Chief Commissioner of the inquiry, these calls are legal imperatives that will transform systematic and societal values that have maintained colonial violence against Indigenous women, girls, and the 2S LGBTQIA community. It also draws from over 2,000 Canadian testimonies. The inquiry's final report was given to the federal government at the closing ceremony on June 3, 2019 at the Museum of History in Quebec. The report goes into immense detail of methods the government must act upon to attempt to remedy the situation. The report states that Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to be violently targeted than any other demographical member in Canada. As per Statistics Canada, the victimized Indigenous women made up 25% of all female homicide victims between 2001 and 2015. Some of the highlighted suggestions made include handling homicides involving domestic abuse as murder in the first degree. They also asked that the Gladue principles be considered. These principles, a part of the criminal code, state that judges must consider any historical or cultural context of Indigenous offenders when sentencing. The report also calls for equal official language status of Indigenous languages to French and English. The first line of the report's preface states, "This report is about deliberate race, identity, and gender-based genocide." The report also states that the ongoing violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls in Canada amounts to genocide. However, Trudeau is reluctant to identify the national crisis as such. Subsequently, a supplementary report is being made on genocide as it is legally defined. At the closing ceremony on June 3rd, Seamus O'Regan, the Minister of Indigenous Services, responded to the report by saying that the government's job now is to develop a national action plan to implement the recommendations in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governments and organizations. The Native Women's Association of Canada began formulating a database in 2005 of cases, and in 2015 they published a report containing 582 missing and murdered Indigenous women as part of the Sisters in Spirit initiative. The RCMP's 2014 estimate named 1,200 cases between 1980 and 2012. Over 4,000 Indigenous women have gone missing or have been murdered in the last few decades. Currently, FILUs, or Family Information Liaison Units, have been established to aid families in accessing information about missing friends or family. In correlation with this initiative, a toll-free 24/7 crisis line is in place Canada-wide. Now let's talk about why this issue is important to Canadian law and society. The report's suggestions target all citizens in Canada. The recommendations address Indigenous rights and security and suggest changes that should be made within industries, Correctional Service Canada, and civil services like media or healthcare, but also changes that should be made by all Canadians. This national crisis is a prevalent civic issue, a perfect storm of lack of representation in government and power, political insensitivity towards minority groups, social unacceptance, and sluggish political processes towards improvement have all contributed to making the issue worse rather than attempting to remedy it. The law has clearly failed the population of Indigenous women, so much so that a report with over 200 recommendations and billions of dollars were required to simply address the issue and present a plan of mitigation, not including any actual concrete action. Now on to current policies and the legal status of the issue. The national inquiry formally ended with the closing ceremony in June 2019. Simply, this was the formal presentation of the report to the federal government. The inquiry was originally the government's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 41. Through extensions and further funding, the report continued to gain traction and information from families and survivors. In the time it took for the report to be published, the government promised not to be stagnant. Interim recommendations given by the inquiry were applied. For example, Canada took action by extending the time frame of the FILUs and funding community organization to support families until March 2020. They created a commemoration fund to honor the victims, allocated $1.25 million for 2 years of continual police policy and practice review with Indigenous peoples, and invested $9.6 million over a term of 5 years to the RCMP's new National Office of Investigative Standards and Practices, whose work will focus on the epidemic. They are now staffing 10 full-time positions allocated to the investigation of MMIWG cases, as well as improved cultural awareness training. As has been made evident throughout this presentation so far, some of the major stakeholders in this issue are as follows. The stakeholders of this issue are divided into 3 main groups. The first group revolves around the survivors and their loved ones. Family and friends of survivors are often the ones who begin raising awareness. For example, Tamara Chipman co-founded the Walk for Justice after her niece's disappearance. The second group of stakeholders revolves around the community. Some examples of Indigenous organizations and communities include the Assembly of First Nations, which advocates for the prioritization of Indigenous rights, and WMN, Women of the Métis Nation. Some grassroots groups in terms of this particular issue include Sisters in Spirit, No More Silence, Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, KAIROS Social Justice Organization, and Amnesty International Canada. The third and final group of stakeholders revolves around the government. A group within Canadian Parliament called INAC, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, is also working on the issue. Unfortunately, most of the cases relevant to this issue go unsolved. The case examples are typically cold cases. This means that most are not litigated in the Canadian court system. Here are some of the most infamous stories of this issue. As per a report published by Amnesty International, there are numerous cases that continue to go unsolved. Those that are typically solved find murders to be related to domestic violence, though this is not always the case. Cases such as Crawford v. Her Majesty the Queen have found murderers guilty simply for hate crimes. This is one example of a solved case. It's quite rare. John Martin Crawford murdered 3 Indigenous women by the names of Shelley Napope, Kalinda Waterhead, and Ava Tesa, pictured here from left to right. A journalist who covered the trial is quoted as saying, "I don't get the sense that the general public cares much about missing or murdered Aboriginal women. It's all part of this indifference to the lives of Aboriginal people. They don't seem to matter as much as white people." End quote. Another example is the case of Robert Pickton, a Canadian serial killer. He was convicted in 2007 for murdering 6 women. A lengthy investigation ensued and found evidence of many other murders. The RCMP investigated the disappearance of 65 women, 16 of whom were Indigenous. Given the location, Vancouver, this number grossly exceeds the proportion of Indigenous women living in that area. An infamous case that has continued to remain unsolved for decades is that of Helen Betty Osborne. She was a 19-year-old Cree student living in Manitoba. In 1971, she was abducted, raped, and murdered by 4 white men in the town of The Pas. A provincial inquiry was ordered and found that the Canadian government had failed her. The inquiry found that the police investigation had been biased and sloppy. It took more than 15 years for just one of the 4 men to be convicted. The inquiry also concluded, shamefully, that the police had been aware of the victimization of Indigenous women and girls in the Pas, but, quote, did not feel that the practice necessitated any particular vigilance. Well, to be frank, the government and justice system has been handed 231 ways to change and fix the issue. To be more specific, let's take a look at some of the more notable recommendations that the report includes. Here are some of the most notable recommendations from the report. Let's take a look now at why change has yet to happen. Change is slow and requires time. Now that the research has been done and the recommendations made, as well as the interim progressive action being taken, what's left to do is to amend the issue, starting with the policy changes needed in government, which, as we know, is slow in Canada. The government continues to work on mitigating this issue. Presently, the government is investing in education, housing, and reforming child and family services to be better suited for prevention. They are also working with Indigenous organizations as part of its time, Canada's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. A larger step being taken is strengthening justice by taking a review of the criminal justice system. An important aspect of Indigenous self-governance and community well-being is the administration of justice. Budget 2019 offers a proposal of $10 million over a term of 5 years to revitalize Indigenous laws. The Indigenous Justice Program is used to offer alternatives to typical justice processes. Also, many new pieces of legislation were introduced to address violence against women. Bill C-75 proposes measures to improve protection of victims of intimate partner violence and human trafficking. Bill C-78 suggests amendments to the Divorce Act. These would make it mandatory for courts to consider family violence during proceedings. The RCMP are still actively investigating cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Project Devote in Manitoba and ePANA in British Columbia are investigating also. As of June 2019, over $200 million has been invested across government programs to prevent gender-based violence, support survivors, and improve the justice system through, quote, Canada's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence, end quote. As of 2020, the MMIWG Inquiry Report, Reclaiming Power in Place, is being translated into more Indigenous languages. It was originally only published in English, French, and in Inuktitut. The UN has declared an International Decade of Indigenous Languages planned to start in 2022. They also declared 2019 the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Now, here's what I think should be done to improve this legal issue in Canada. The calls for justice in the recommendation are split into 4 sections: calls that apply to all governments, calls that apply to industries and institutions, calls applying to all Canadians, and finally, calls specifically for justice for Inuit, Métis, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Along with reading and abiding by the calls for all Canadians, the public must hold the government accountable on its progress. This mustn't be another given and forgotten band-aid of a solution. To be specific to the legal issue, 58 of the 231 recommendations are for all governments. A part of the recommendation, Call for Justice number 10, states the federal government should annually report its progress on implementing the 231 calls. I think that alongside continuing to spread awareness of the report, the government's progress and the funding of reparative services to the community, everyone must be held accountable. To continue to keep this issue at the forefront of our minds. If nothing changes, then nothing will change. Thank you for listening. That concludes my presentation.